Hello, welcome to Chapter 5. Education in America really started with the Puritans. Puritans had come to America to work for their religious freedom. They were very devoted to their religion, therefore, education was based on understanding religion. The first schools were basically what we would think of today as home schools, but these were known as dame schools. The dame schools were taught by a woman or dame in their own homes. Values, manners, social graces, and some vocational training may have been trained by the parents or grandparents. The dame schools were there to teach reading, writing, and computation. If a student wanted to move on to take on a vocation, they would get an apprenticeship under a master. This is akin to the current apprenticeships done with master electricians or master plumbers, and the master would act in loco parentis or in lieu of the parents, being basically a guardian. Because if you wanted an apprenticeship, a boy could start as early as age 7. In 1647, in Massachusetts, since that was where the Puritans were based, there was the Massachusetts Law of 1647, which is known as the Old Deluder Satan Law. This was an attempt by the Puritans to thwart Satan's trickery with Bible reading. Every town of 50 households had to appoint and pay a teacher for reading and writing. Every town with 100 households must provide a Latin grammar school to prepare youths for universities under a penalty of £5 for failure to do so. By 1680, these laws spread throughout most of New England. Now, thinking about that, you may be wondering what a Latin grammar school is. In 1680, the Latin grammar schools were schools for boys, and the parents had to pay to send them there. In 1635, there were only about 15 of these schools established. Uh, I apologize. In 1635, the first Latin grammar school was made in Boston, and it was basically a prep school, as we would hear them from Europe. Now, if you think about puritanical colonial education, there were not a lot of opportunities for certain groups. Among these were women or girls, as well as blacks and poor children. Remember that the Latin grammar schools were only for boys and you had to pay to attend. Since 1619, blacks and Native Americans were typically denied educational opportunities. While there were groups such as the Quakers creating special schools for children of color, these were the exception but not the rule. Now, Thomas Jefferson, which I'm sure we've all heard of as our third president, wanted to go beyond educating the small elite class or providing just religious instruction. And he maintained that there should be more widely education should be more widely available to white children from all economic standings. But obviously, he did not plan for the education of black children, Native American children, or girls. In 1749, Benjamin Franklin wrote proposals relating to the youth of Pennsylvania, and he was talking about having a different kind of school known as the Academy. The Franklin Academy was created in 1751. You could be taught subjects such as religious, without religious influence, math, astronomy, athletics, navigation, dramatics, and bookkeeping. This Franklin Academy sparked the creation of about 6,000 academies throughout the next century. In 1837, Horace Mann helped create the Massachusetts State Board of Education, becoming its secretary, which would basically be the current equivalent of a state superintendent. Horace Mann became the advocate for establishing a common school, which would be open to all. Today, that's known as an elementary school. He is known to be the father of public education. He really wanted to allow all students, and by the way, we are saying all white male students, to attend at least elementary school for free. He was hoping to identify and nurture the talents of the poor as well as the wealthy children to ameliorate social disharmony. Now, later he also worked to establish normal schools, and these were in Massachusetts. A normal school was a school to teach teachers how to become teachers, which included teaching pedagogy and effectively teaching the norms and behaviors acceptable in a school. We are basically following that rule today by having our teacher preparation programs. The Native Americans were basically miseducated because while they did have their own forms of tribal education, the American education system only wanted to educate Native Americans to become civilized Christians. They did not really want to allow the Native Americans to hold on to their traditions and languages. So this is a very upsetting part of the history of America. Now, if you wanted to be a teacher in early America, initially they were males, and women were only the teachers in the dame schools. So teaching was a very gendered career. Now, the early part of the 20th century, women became more teachers, but they were tended to be the spinsters. This means the unmarried women who were not ever expected to get married and definitely did not have children. As women came into teaching, there was a lot of worry that the women were going to be feminizing the boys. And this was supposedly worked on during the teacher training. The women who were teaching were pretty much made fun of because they were not known to be attractive enough to have a mate or to have children. Now, this was all elementary school. The first secondary school, or what we think of as a high school, was not made in America until 1821 and was established in Boston. The English Classical School had enrolled 176 students, obviously all boys. And this was really a slow movement to take hold. It was not until 1852 that Boston was able to have a similar school for girls. This was typically private with charging tuition until 1874. The Kalamazoo, Michigan case ruled that taxes could be used to support secondary schools. So that's pretty interesting that we had to wait a long time for any high schools to be available to students and even longer to have students be able to attend these schools for free. In 1896, John Dewey had a laboratory school at the University of Chicago. This was important because this was the beginning of progressive education movement. The education was not only concerned about reading and math and career preparation, but also health concerns and community lives. And it was really using applied psychology and social sciences to assist with classroom practices. So students were not just passively listening to the teacher anymore. They were encouraged to have problem solving because this is a student-centered approach. The teachers were encouraged to follow the students' interests. This can be seen often today still in early childhood education. Now, in 1958, we had the National Defense Education Act. This was basically to enhance the security of the nation and to develop the mental resources and technical skills of its young men and women. It was made so that we would have more people able to defend our country. This was in response to the Russians launching Sputnik, the first uh, space launch. The Americans did not want to be left behind in the space race. So a lot of money was put into math and science. In 1787, you had the Northwest Ordinance. Now, while this was not really an educational law, it allowed there to be schools set up in the newly settled territories, and that is really an important aspect. Plessy versus Ferguson. I'm sure everyone has heard about the segregation. That Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 legally sanctioned education. It is known for separate but equal. When you have de jure segregation, that is the segregation by law under Plessy versus Ferguson. De facto segregation, which does still exist today, is segregation based on residential patterns. 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. But in the 1960s, we did see within the school segregation, so that while students could attend the same school, many times you'd see Black students on one side of the room, white students on the other. Same with the lunchrooms. Now, if we look at the Hispanics and Latinos, currently they're about 25% of our school-age population. There are a number of barriers that can be seen, and a lot of this has to do with English. When English is not your first language, it can be more difficult. But we have to realize that there is no official language in the United States. So we can be teaching students in a different language if we choose to. Now, the Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders had a lot of things to overcome as well. We had different immigration acts limiting immigration to the United States, as well as acts that basically during the Second World War halted the freedom of Japanese individuals and made them live in internment camps within the borders of the United States. You can still see a lot of the ramifications of this today. Arab Americans, we know after 9/11, there was a lot of threats against Arab Americans. And please realize Arabs and Muslims are not necessarily the same. Arabs are cultural group. They come from a specific area of the world. Muslims are people practicing the religion of Islam. When we look at women and education, there's a number of people to look at who we may or may not have heard of before. In the colonial era, you had Emma Hart Willard. She wanted to be able to have more education for females. And in the 1800s, she opened the Troy Female Seminary, and that was preparing women to become teachers. She wanted women to be able to get that higher education that was very open to the men of the time. In the 1800s, there was Prudence Crandall. While Prudence was a white woman, she was very dedicated to the education of Black girls. She would advertise for pupils in the abolitionist magazine, The Liberator. She wanted to make sure that these students were able to read and write and have a life that they wanted. Now, you'll also hear Maria Montessori. You will hear that name a lot if you're doing early childhood. She is from Italy. In Italy, she created Casa dei Bambini and educated disadvantaged children. She was a doctor, and she created a method for education that allows children to work on tasks individually. She's also credited with helping to create child-sized furniture in the classroom and practical tasks to be taught to young children. As early as 1592 to 1670, Comenius was supporting universal education. He identified stages of learning and really wanted to show that all people have the ability to learn and should be allowed to learn. Friedrich Froebel, who was German, founded the first kindergarten in Germany. Kindergarten honestly means child's garden, and he wanted to make sure that children were educated as young as 5 years old. He created what is called gifts, which were toys that the children could learn through. Johann Herbert, in the 1800s, contributed to moral development in education, creating a structure for the methodology of instruction. That way, all students would be taught in a similar method. Jean Piaget had his theory of cognitive development, very much still taught today. B.F. Skinner is known as the father of behaviorism. He was showing the ways to promote learning by altering the environment as well as using positive and negative reinforcements. And a little more recently, we had Paulo Freire. He wrote the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Now, Freire abandoned his career in law in Brazil, and he wanted to show how to educate the poor and the politically oppressed. He said you should no longer have teacher-centered classrooms. Students have knowledge and should be able to also work towards learning through their own interests for social change. So I hope that helps you with the history. Bye.